And on that note, I need to welcome Amanda Wellesley, Assistant Director of Cladding Operations from the VBA, to the stage, and she's going to give us a presentation on the findings from the Victorian Cladding Taskforce and Audit. So, learnings from the past to regulate for a safer future. Please make Amanda welcome. Thank you. You're right.
Thank you, John. I wasn't sure if you were going to maybe scrap my speech there. That was a really interesting discussion, and certainly a fair bit of the issues that I hope to discuss today have already been touched on, so won't come as much of a surprise. Thank you. When I was asked to speak to you all today, I was really excited to be able to represent some of the great work of the statewide cladding audit, as well as start a conversation with you all about how we can learn from what we're seeing to better inform our practice as practitioners and protect the community and the industry that we are all so very passionate about. So we've been talking about cladding for about 2 years now, almost 2 years. So I'm going to take it as read that most of you have a good understanding of what the audit scope and methodology is, and I don't intend to cover any old ground there. There is a wealth of information on our website and out there in the public sphere if you're up for a little bit of reading later this evening. So we're going to talk today about what we're finding. It's my job to keep you awake for the next 15 minutes or so before you get your sugar and caffeine fix. So what better way to start than talk about what we've done so far. We've talked a lot today about the fact that the VBA and the Victorian Cladding Taskforce has conducted over 1,400 audits to date. That includes work in both the pilot, the Victorian Cladding Taskforce pilot, that included 5 municipalities in Metro Melbourne, as well as the work of both the priority list as well as the broader methods. And we're seeing performance solutions to justify leaving out stuff that would ordinarily be required to be in there, but not actually replacing it with anything. And this is a bit of an interesting concept. So when you consider that we have both a prescriptive and a performance-based building code, and if you can take the view that deemed to satisfy is probably the bare minimum benchmark of where we need to be in terms of safety and compliance. And then you look at how some of these designs are coming together and how some of these buildings are being constructed. And they're using performance solutions, to take out a lot of those things that a deemed to satisfy standard would normally require. They're using concessions for deemed to satisfy provisions, and then they're applying complex performance solutions on top of that. And what ultimately that leads to is multiple departures from DTS requirements that result in compounding safety issues and risks to the occupants. So just as a bit of an extreme example of some of the things that we're seeing, there is a building out there in this state right now that has a performance solution that sought to justify why an apartment building should only have a single exit stair. And the way in which it went about justifying that is that all of the apartments in the building had balconies. So when the fire brigade came to attend and fight the fire, the owners could stand on their balconies and they could be in constant communication with the brigade about their predicament. I'm not kidding, it's actually a real issue that we've seen. While it's a very extreme example, it certainly does illustrate some of the challenges that we're seeing. And these examples I'm talking about in those apartment buildings exist entirely in one single building, so multiple issues in one building, and they're also replicated across all high-risk buildings that we've seen to date. This is not isolated, this is systemic. We've already talked about that today. And it is not delivering the outcomes that the community expect or the objectives of the Act. So while we discussed today how we can learn from some of these findings, Sue already mentioned this morning that the VBA is taking on further research work and is working in partnership with a couple of universities in order to research further the findings to inform the regulatory framework and also the competencies of practitioners. So moving on to rectification, we are still only in the relatively early stages of understanding what this entire end-to-end rectification process looks like, but our maturity in this space grows by the day. What we do know is the community expects that swift and decisive action will be taken to eradicate these products from buildings and protect the community. However, owners are going to have to navigate the complexities of how to rectify their buildings by adopting solutions that are effective and long-term and address not just the combustible cladding, but the deficiencies in the fire safety systems and consequential issues associated with it. Owners are currently facing those issues, and the VBA are working with them, particularly on those sites where we've been delegated the MBS functions to start on the path to rectification. Many more owners will be affected as we move through the identification and assessment of the most at-risk buildings across the state. So it's very timely that we all come together today to consider our approach moving forward and to prevent the problems of the future. So how can we learn from the past to regulate for a safer future? Where do we start? The systemic failures that we're seeing have occurred over a long period of time, and they're certainly more detailed than a 15-minute time slot can possibly cover, or that I could ever hope to discuss with you in detail at this particular time. So we've talked a lot today, and there's been a lot of commentary about all of the different issues that building surveyors are facing in this space. So I thought it might be appropriate to start with a somewhat simple concept, which is that we need to reconnect with our purpose and start the process of much needed cultural change. So the first question I have for you is, do you consider yourself a regulator? Steve Baxis mentioned earlier, maybe some of the solutions is that maybe we need to start thinking of ourselves as co-regulators. Certainly when I was in private industry, I definitely wouldn't have used this term to describe the work that I do to the community and the people that I worked with. And maybe you don't think of yourself as that way, but the community certainly does. And we need to keep this in mind when we interact with our clients, our peers, and our community. We have always had a shared responsibility to protect the community, but we haven't done a very good job of that up until now. It's a tough and uncomfortable reality, but it's one that we need to own if we're going to collaborate and collectively improve standards across the industry. The journey to cultural change in the way we regulate for safety, not just compliance or the bare minimum standards of the BCA, but truly lead together for improved industry behaviour and standards, lies in reconnecting with our purpose, our statutory role and responsibilities in the industry. Who are we regulating for? That's also been discussed a fair bit today. We regulate for the owners of buildings, for the current and future occupiers, so that they can be safe and healthy. We regulate for the community who use buildings to live and work and can do so in a safe and compliant built environment. Who do we need to regulate in order to make that happen? We need to regulate our peers. But that's a challenge. So how do we move from short-term transactional approach at the design and approval stage to that of a long-term outcome focus for safety? We need to challenge the thinking of the practitioners that we regulate to protect the people we regulate for and the people who will own and use buildings in future. We need to challenge the fire engineering report that attempts to demonstrate the compounding departures from the safety principles of the BCA is acceptable. We need to challenge the design that leaves you struggling to find the specifications and details to demonstrate to you how it's all actually going to go together. And we need to challenge the builder, particularly the builder-developer, who uses performance solutions under the guise of innovation to justify deleting critical systems or substitutes products during construction to save a buck or make life a bit easier. Get the extra documentation, ask more questions, engage broader stakeholders to be better informed and help others. As a practitioner, one of the most valuable things for me in my role so far in the cladding audit has actually been the opportunity to sit in the advisory reference panels with the experts at the table. And when you hear from the brigade and the complexities of these buildings when they are having to attend these buildings and carry out search and rescue functions, and they're saying that the systems weren't even there for them to be able to effectively do their job, protect themselves and protect those people in the building. As all of those systems were so complex that they couldn't possibly have been maintained in the way that they were originally intended in order for them to be effective at that time. So engage with those broader stakeholders. Don't just make an application to them, actually have a chat with them. I'm sure many of you are all doing that already, but it has been incredibly valuable to understand the reasons why we require things at the front end and how valuable they are to the people who use these buildings. So I know you're all thinking a few things at this point. As a building surveyor, I've been in these conversations for many years. You're thinking there aren't enough building surveyors around to tackle this issue. You're thinking that the Act says that we can't impose greater or lesser standards. And we've already discussed today that there's a perception that if I don't do it, they're just going to go down the road to the next guy who will. I think, thankfully, Bronwyn proved earlier with a show of hands that there's at least a couple of other 100 people that those people might go to that are still going to get the answer that is no, I won't issue you a building permit on that design. So today you're all registered to be part of a conversation about how we can all strengthen our shared responsibility to ensure a safer future and better compliance outcomes in the industry. So if we all take a joined up approach and we hold the line of good regulatory practice, then collectively we've taken a big step towards improving standards and correcting the mistakes of the past. Sorry, I haven't been clicking. So consider that when you challenge your peers' thinking and receive improved documentation, evidence and information to support better building outcomes, you protect yourself in the process. You mitigate your statutory exposure and you inherently protect those people that you regulate and those people that you regulate for. And you shift the burden of those statutory risks that we've discussed today across the supply chain. When we hold the line, we can turn our weakness into a strength. So there's not too many of us out there and we're all swamped, but our statutory role is written into law and building cannot happen unless we allow it. We hold the power and it is our shared responsibility to challenge safety and compliance concepts and require better. Sure, a builder or designer might balk at being asked to make the extra effort to improve their practice, but they're not going to take their business elsewhere, as we've seen today, if they share the same principles of building better outcomes and appreciate the protection that we afford them when we ask them to do a little bit more. And if they do, let them go. It's our responsibility to call out the practitioners who are not acting professionally or competently and putting the industry and community at risk. If we accept a substandard design and construction, we'll continue to receive it and we will be held responsible for the consequences. I was recently introduced to the concept of radical incrementalism, which is effectively the practice of making radical strategic microshifts that don't entirely disrupt the existing paradigm all at once, but slowly and methodically over time. It's often applied to public policy making, but it really resonated with me when I was reflecting on the cladding issues and how we can positively and realistically affect the cultural change in our industry. It's not about drastic overnight revolution. A sustained incremental approach to changing business and statutory practices will have the long-term effect needed to building back some of the confidence lost. It will expand industry knowledge and skills and deliver a safer built environment for the community. So if we're going to take this cladding issue and we're going to make it a catalyst for change, and then we need to hold the line of good regulatory practice. We need to keep public safety and the delivery of safer built outcomes at the very forefront of our decision making as regulators and make incremental adjustments with the support of our colleagues to improve industry standards and our profession. So let's keep the conversation going this afternoon. And lastly, I'd just like to say thank you, both as a VBA employee and a dedicated public servant, but also as a building surveyor, for your commitment today to attend and your commitment to a partnership and a shared responsibility for protecting the community by being here today. Thank you very much.